West of the French coast in June 1944, the control room of U-505 fell into tense silence. Oberleutnant Paul Meyer stood frozen at the hydrophone station, his headset pressed tight against his ears. What he heard defied everything the Kriegsmarine had taught him about Allied anti-submarine weapons. There was no explosion, no thunderous detonation that might signal a miss, just a scraping sound overhead like someone dragging metal rods across the hull. Then nothing. 3 seconds of absolute silence. The crew exchanged glances. Every man aboard knew what depth charges sounded like. They roared, shook the boat, and announced their presence whether they hit or missed. This was different. This was quiet, and quiet meant something far worse. The weapon that terrified Meyer and his crew that June morning had a deceptively simple name: the Hedgehog. It consisted of 24 spigot mortars arranged in 4 cradles of 6 projectiles each, mounted on the forward deck of Allied escort vessels. To understand why this weapon struck such fear into German submariners, we must examine the situation in early 1943, when the balance of the Battle of the Atlantic hung by a thread. For 3 years, Germany's U-boats had been the apex predators of the North Atlantic. From September 1939 through March 1943, they sank over 14 million tons of Allied shipping. In June 1942 alone, U-boats sank 637,000 tons of British merchant vessels. The convoy system helped, but didn't solve the fundamental problem. U-boats could still approach submerged, fire their torpedoes, and slip away into the depths before escorts could respond effectively. The standard anti-submarine weapon throughout this period was the depth charge, a barrel-shaped explosive device weighing between 300 and 600 pounds, filled with either Amatol or Torpex high explosive. The principle was straightforward. Escorts would detect a submarine using ASDIC, the British term for sonar, then race over the contact point and roll or launch depth charges set to detonate at a predetermined depth. In practice, depth charges had severe limitations. They detonated at a set depth regardless of whether they were anywhere near the target, meaning the attacking vessel had to estimate not only where the submarine was, but also how deep it had gone. More critically, depth charges were dropped or fired from the stern and sides of the attacking ship. By the time the charges were released, the ship had already passed over the submarine's last known position. This gap in coverage became known as the blind period. During the final approach, ASDIC contact would be lost as the attacking vessel closed to within 200 yards of the target. The submarine effectively vanished from detection. U-boat commanders were extensively trained on how to exploit this window. Korvettenkapitän Werner Hartenstein, commander of U-156, described the tactic. Execute sharp course changes to starboard at maximum angle and reduce speed to 4 knots. The depth charges would explode where the boat had been, not where it was. The third limitation was psychological. Even when depth charges missed their target completely, they still exploded. To the crew of an escort vessel, that explosion felt like success. In reality, many U-boats survived hundreds of depth charge attacks. U-427, operating off the coast of Norway in April 1945, endured 678 depth charges over many hours and survived. British statisticians calculated the grim truth. Out of every 80 depth charge attacks, only 1 resulted in a confirmed U-boat kill. At that rate, the Allies were building merchant ships faster than U-boats could sink them, but only barely. The margin was too thin. Something had to change. The birth of the Hedgehog. The weapon that would change everything began as an infantry mortar concept developed between the World Wars by Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Blacker of the Royal Artillery. The spigot mortar inverted the traditional mortar design. Instead of loading a bomb into a tube with the propellant at the base, Blacker's system placed the propellant charge on the projectile itself, which would slide down onto a fixed rod. The Royal Navy's Department of Miscellaneous Weapons Development saw potential in adapting Blacker's spigot mortar for anti-submarine warfare. The core problem they needed to solve was a head-throwing capability. If a weapon could launch projectiles forward into the area where the submarine was still visible on ASDIC, it would eliminate the blind period entirely. Work began in 1941. The prototype launcher was installed on board HMS Westcott for testing. The mathematics alone took months to resolve. The challenge included calculating the exact recoil force, calibrating projectile trajectory so all 24 bombs would land in an elliptical pattern roughly 100 feet in diameter, and creating a fusing mechanism sensitive enough to detonate on contact with a submarine hull, but robust enough not to explode prematurely. By early 1942, the system was ready for production. Each Hedgehog projectile measured 7.2 inches in diameter and 46.5 inches in length. The warhead contained 35 pounds of Torpex, and the total weight of each projectile was 65 pounds. When fired, the launcher ripple-fired the projectiles in pairs, with highest trajectories first, so that, despite leaving the launcher at slightly different times, all 24 would strike the water and sink at roughly the same moment. The sink rate of Hedgehog projectiles was 23 feet per second, significantly faster than the 8 to 9 feet per second sink rate of conventional depth charges. A Hedgehog projectile would reach 200 feet depth in under 10 seconds, and a U-boat's maximum test depth was 750 feet in just over half a minute. The true innovation that made the Hedgehog the most feared anti-submarine weapon of the war was the contact fuse. Unlike depth charges, which detonated at a set depth whether near the target or not, Hedgehog projectiles only exploded if they physically struck something solid, a submarine hull, a rock formation on the seafloor. Otherwise, they would simply sink to the bottom and become inert. This design choice had profound consequences. It meant that sonar conditions remained undisturbed after a miss. If the attacking escort heard no explosions, they knew immediately that they had missed and could maintain sonar contact for another attack run without waiting for the water to settle. It also meant that even a single hit was usually fatal. A 35-pound Torpex charge detonating directly against the pressure hull would punch a hole 3 to 4 inches in diameter through the steel. At 250 to 300 feet depth, water would enter through that hole at approximately 400 gallons per minute. The flooding was effectively unstoppable. As water poured in, atmospheric pressure inside the submarine would spike and temperature would climb rapidly, reaching 200 to 300 degrees within minutes. The crew would die from searing lung damage before the boat descended deep enough for the pressure hull to collapse entirely. Production of the Hedgehog began in late 1942, and by early 1943, over 100 Allied escort vessels had been retrofitted with the system. However, initial operational results were disappointing. From January through April 1943, the success rate hovered around 5%, only marginally better than depth charges. Crews began to distrust the weapon. The silent miss felt like failure in a way that the booming explosion of a depth charge did not. Part of the problem was technical. Heavy North Atlantic swells would wash over the launcher, soaking the electrical firing circuits. Another issue was the learning curve. Operating the Hedgehog effectively required precise coordination between the sonar operator, the helmsman, and the weapons crew. The breakthrough came from education. Officers were sent to convoy escort bases to conduct ship-wide training sessions, presenting detailed case studies of successful Hedgehog attacks and explaining the mathematics behind the weapon's pattern. They emphasized that while a miss was silent, it also meant you could immediately attack again. The training worked. By mid-1943, as crews gained experience and confidence, the kill rate began to climb. By the end of the war, statistics would show that 1 in every 5 Hedgehog attacks resulted in a confirmed U-boat kill, a ratio of 5.7 to 1 compared to the 60 to 1 ratio for depth charges. In British Royal Navy alone, Hedgehog attacks accounted for 47 confirmed U-boat kills out of 268 attacks. In actual combat effectiveness, the Hedgehog was more than 10 times deadlier than the weapon it supplemented. American success. The U.S. Navy proved even more successful with the weapon. American destroyer escorts, optimized specifically for anti-submarine warfare, carried the Hedgehog as standard equipment. The integration of advanced sonar data feeding directly to weapons targeting allowed for unprecedented accuracy. The most dramatic demonstration of Hedgehog effectiveness came in May 1944 in the Pacific Theater. The destroyer escort USS England, operating as part of an anti-submarine hunter-killer group, encountered a Japanese submarine scouting line. Over a 12-day period, England sank 6 Japanese submarines, all 6 kills made using the Hedgehog. Fleet Admiral Ernest King sent a message to the ship's crew. They'll always be in England in the United States Navy. For German submarine crews operating in the North Atlantic during 1943 and 1944, the Hedgehog represented a fundamental shift in the nature of undersea warfare. For 3 years, they had been the hunters. Now, increasingly, they were the hunted. The psychological training German U-boat crews received at the submarine school in Gotenhofen painted a clear picture of Allied anti-submarine capabilities. Depth charges were predictable. You could hear them coming, the characteristic thrashing of propellers overhead as the escort vessel accelerated for its attack run, then the rolling splash as the charges hit the water. You had precious seconds to maneuver, drop to maximum depth, execute a hard turn, cut the electric motors to silent running. If you survived the first pattern, you had time for the escort to lose contact in the turbulent water. The statistics from 1940 through 1942 supported this belief. U-boats were being lost, but at rates the Kriegsmarine considered acceptable. For every boat that failed to return, 2 more were commissioned. Then came May 1943, Black May as German submariners would call it. In 31 days, 43 U-boats were lost, representing more than a fifth of operational boats. Among the dead was Kapitänleutnant Peter Donitz, the 21-year-old son of the Grand Admiral, lost aboard U-954 while attacking convoy SC-130. 5 U-boats attacked that convoy. All 5 were sunk. Not a single merchant ship was lost. Admiral Donitz ordered most operational U-boats to withdraw from the North Atlantic convoy routes. The official explanation blamed improved Allied radar and long-range patrol aircraft, but for the men who survived attacks during Black May, who felt their boats shudder under weapons that made no sound until they struck, a different truth was emerging. Oberleutnant Paul Meyer, control room watch officer aboard U-505, experienced his first Hedgehog attack in early June 1944. His post-war account captures the psychological shock of encountering this weapon. They were running submerged when the hydrophone operator reported propeller noises approaching fast. Battle stations were called, and they prepared for a depth charge attack. What happened next was unexpected. There was a scraping sound along the hull like someone dragging chains across the deck, then silence. They waited for the explosions that did not come. The captain ordered silent running. They maintained depth and reduced speed to minimum. Then came 3 sharp explosions in rapid succession, not the deep boom of depth charges, but sharper, closer sounds. One was very close, and the boat jumped sideways. They lost trim and started going down. Another pattern landed with 2 explosions. One struck the aft deck right above the motor room. The lights went out, emergency lighting came on, and someone was screaming in the motor room. They went deeper to 200 meters, but the propeller noises stayed with them. The escort knew exactly where they were. What Meyer and his crew were experiencing was the fundamental innovation of the Hedgehog. The weapon eliminated the blind period that U-boat commanders had been trained to exploit. Unlike depth charges, the Hedgehog fired forward, so the escort maintained continuous sonar tracking throughout the attack. If the first salvo missed, the escort could immediately adjust course and fire again, and again, until the contact was destroyed or lost. The contact fuse mechanism meant that submarine crews had no way of judging how close the attacks were coming until it was too late. Silence meant the projectiles had missed, but it also meant the escort still had perfect sonar contact and was lining up the next attack. The weapon created a psychological trap. Silence was not safe. Silence meant the hunt was still on. Fatal encounters. U-505 survived that June attack through a combination of skill and fortune. After the second Hedgehog salvo struck the aft deck, causing flooding in the motor room, the chief engineer managed to restore trim. The captain ordered maximum depth, and they descended to 280 meters, below their rated test depth. The hull groaned under the pressure and rivets began to weep water, but they went deep enough that the escort sonar lost reliable contact. Not every crew was so fortunate. U-638, operating in the North Atlantic as part of a wolf pack targeting convoy ONS-5, encountered HMS Sunflower, a Flower-class corvette equipped with an early Hedgehog installation. The commander of the corvette attended the Hedgehog training course and understood the weapon's capabilities. He maintained a steady course and speed during the final approach and fired at exactly the right moment. 24 projectiles arced through the darkness and splashed into the Atlantic. They sank at 23 feet per second. U-638 was at 90 meters depth, attempting to go deeper. The submarine's crew heard nothing, just 3 nearly simultaneous explosions against the pressure hull. One projectile struck forward of the control room, another hit midships on the port side, and the third struck the aft torpedo room. The effect was catastrophic. At 90 meters depth, when a 3 or 4 inch hole is punched through a pressure hull, water enters at extraordinary velocity. The forward compartment flooded in less than 30 seconds. The men there died almost instantly. The control room crew had slightly more time as water rushed in through damaged bulkhead doors. The pressure inside spiked and temperature climbed rapidly. Breathing became impossible. The commander attempted to blow ballast and surface to give the crew a chance to survive in the water, but the compressed air systems had been damaged. U-638 continued descending. At 160 meters, the pressure hull began to buckle. At 190 meters, it collapsed. The implosion was violent enough that the crew of HMS Sunflower felt the shock wave through their own hull. All 44 men aboard U-638 died within 4 minutes of the Hedgehog salvo striking home.
The survivors who came back, men from boats that managed to evade Hedgehog attacks or who were pulled from the water after their boats were sunk, told consistent stories about the weapon. You could not hear it coming. You could not judge how close it was. You could not tell if you had successfully evaded until you were already dead or miraculously alive. The randomness was psychologically devastating. Depth charges, for all their danger, followed patterns. You could develop tactics to counter them. You could train for them. You could control, to some degree, your fate through skill and experience. Hedgehog removed that illusion of control. The only way to survive was to not be detected in the first place. Once an escort had sonar contact and was within Hedgehog range, skill mattered far less than luck. From January 1943 through May 1945, 785 U-boats were lost. At least 47 were confirmed killed by Hedgehog attacks in British service alone, with American destroyer escorts accounting for additional kills. But the influence of the Hedgehog extended beyond direct kill statistics. The weapon forced tactical changes throughout the U-boat fleet. The Kriegsmarine response was to accelerate development of acoustic homing torpedoes. The T-5 Zaukoenig entered service in September 1943, allowing U-boats to attack escort vessels from longer ranges. In practice, the acoustic torpedoes provided only limited relief, as Allied escorts quickly deployed noise-making decoys. More fundamentally, the introduction of escort carriers and very long-range patrol aircraft meant U-boats were increasingly vulnerable on the surface and during transit. The Battle of the Atlantic was won by the integration of multiple systems: improved radar, better sonar, more escorts, escort carriers, breaking of German naval codes, and ahead-throwing weapons like the Hedgehog. For the men serving in U-boats, the Hedgehog became a symbol of how completely the tide had turned. Of the approximately 40,000 men who served in the U-boat service during World War II, nearly 30,000 died in action, a casualty rate of 75%, the highest of any branch of any nation's military in the entire war. The end and legacy. The last U-boat sunk by Hedgehog fire was U-881, destroyed off the coast of Rhode Island 2 days before Germany's surrender. Destroyer escorts USS Atherton and USS Moberly gained sonar contact on the submerged submarine and pursued it for 7 hours, making multiple Hedgehog attacks. The final salvo struck U-881 at a depth of 100 feet. There were no survivors from the crew of 48. When the war in Europe officially ended, 156 U-boats were surrendered to Allied forces. Another 222 were scuttled by their crews rather than be handed over. Allied technical intelligence teams interviewed the surviving crewmen while memories were fresh. Hans Wilhelm Koppen, a machinist's mate who served on 3 different boats from 1943 to 1945, described the evolution of crew attitudes. In the beginning, you believed you could outsmart the escorts. You had been trained. You knew the procedures. By 1944, we knew that training meant very little. If an escort had contact and got close enough, you were probably going to die. We had become hunted animals. This shift from hunter to hunted represents the true psychological cost of weapons like the Hedgehog. It removed agency from submarine crews. Their training, experience, and courage still mattered, but they no longer determined survival. The cold mathematics of sonar range, projectile distribution patterns, and explosive yield determined who lived and who died. The Hedgehog remained in service long after the U-boats it was designed to destroy were gone. The U.S. Navy continued using the system through the Cold War, not retiring it until the late 1980s. The Soviet Union developed their own version, which evolved into systems that influenced the design of rocket-launched anti-submarine weapons still in use today. Oberlieutenant Paul Meyer survived the war. U-505 was captured intact and boarded by U.S. Navy personnel before it could be scuttled. Meyer and most of his crew became prisoners of war. After the war, Meyer returned to Germany and worked as a marine engineer. He rarely spoke about his service in U-boats. When he did, he described it matter-of-factly. "We did our duty. Many died. I was fortunate. That was all." That fortune or misfortune, which determined who died and who survived in the U-boat service of World War II, was increasingly influenced by weapons like the Hedgehog. Not because the weapon was perfect, but because it represented a fundamental shift in the nature of anti-submarine warfare, removing the blind period that had allowed U-boats to survive for so long. In that narrow technical innovation lay the difference between life and death for thousands of men on both sides.